Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, man.
Yeah, welcome back, buddy.
Yeah, glad to be here. This is getting interesting.
Yeah, well, I hope it's interesting to people. I love this stuff. This has been core to my own faith journey as a Christian, which maybe we'll touch on later in another or the final episode or something like that. But this is, I can't even remotely begin to describe how important this was for me in deepening, maybe might even be more fair to say becoming a person who is a follower on the way and trying to walk in what that Christian life looks like. I have said, if the Bible could be ever proven as to be false, I would no longer call myself a Christian, because to me it's not a religion, it's not a philosophy, it's a historical reality that is sustained by the evidence, and that's kind of what we're trying to examine in the overall sense of the podcast. It's kind of like, well, is there any validity to that? We're triangulating it back to unmoored, and that the founders thought it was useful, but we're trying to, really address all these questions about, well, is there historical support for it? Is there manuscript support? And what we've been doing the past couple of episodes is looking at, well, this thing called the Bible is a collection of 66 writings, but why those 66? Did somebody pick it out later? And so last time what we did is we kind of were talking our way through the chronology of the New Testament canon, and we got to the point where we said, oh, so there are some councils, not the Council of Nicaea, but it's councils 70 years after that, the last one being in Carthage, that does affirm, a list, but all they were doing was affirming a whole long series of leaders and moments within the church as it's growing from the time of Jesus, 30 AD. It's growing, and they're saying these are the writings. And we talked about the moment when Marcion came along and said, wait, I think it's only this small list, and then the response from that. But even at Marcion, as you noted, it's not like he said, hey, there's other writings because of the time of Marcion. There were, and that's what we're going to look at here in a second. He's saying, no, I just think it's a smaller list. But in response, people are coming out of that. So we kind of moved our way towards it. And you ask at the end of the episode, well, was there any criteria?
Yeah.
And there was. And I gave a synopsis of it. But let's dig a little deeper on that, just a little bit. So the first one is apostolic association, meaning you've got 27 writings, or by that point, you have more than 27. Are these connected specifically to a person who walked with Jesus? All right. So, for instance, just to give you some evidence that we have the history of not just saying, well, the name's on it, because that doesn't help us. So in 125, one of the followers of Jesus, second generation, a guy named Papias, he said that he had talked to John, who told him directly, quote, Mark had written down all that Peter mentioned. So last episode, when I told you that Mark kind of reflects Peter's idea, it's not just Carl's opinion from what I think I know about Peter and his theology. Here we have Papias saying that. Probably Papias, not Papias. Then in 180 AD, Irenaeus, who we've already met, and I told you last episode how he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So Irenaeus says that Polycarp told him that Matthew wrote for a Jewish audience, that Mark wrote and, quote, handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching, that Luke had written, quote, Paul's teachings, and then fourth, that John wrote his gospel while living in Ephesus. So remember, I said John may have written it on on Patmos when he was in exile. But at least here, Polycarp's saying, no. Well, he was in Ephesus. So he's kind of eyewitness. I was with this guy. He was my teacher. You and I have been friends. At one level, you could say you're one of my disciples from back when you were far younger. And so if somebody later said, when did Carl do such and such? You say, dude, I was there.
Yeah.
I was there when we did it. So there's that first person viewpoint.
That's cool.
Okay. So this is why when we get to some of these other writings, a lot of them will have a name of somebody famous associated with it because it was known. Well, if you want to get in the Bible, you need to be, somebody who's connected.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, why does Luke get a 2-volume set? Well, because of Paul. And again, this sort of references into whether Paul is an apostle. But for the early church, Paul was considered an apostle like the other 11 who were with Jesus at the end, minus Judas, obviously. We're going to come back to Judas too in a second. Okay, second criteria. The conformity to the rule of faith, to the core of the Christian tradition. So in other words, what they're trying to say is as I read an individual write, so let's say the second letter to the Thessalonians, right? When I read 2 Thessalonians, does it match with the core orthodoxy or core teaching that I see in the other 26? This, by the way, is why, and I mentioned last episode, every time I gave you somebody prior to the councils, and they said, oh, it was a list. I said sometimes, they had 22 of the books, but there were 5 in dispute. Meaning there was some Christian community somewhere that said, yeah, I'm reading 2 John, and I don't know. Or I'm reading Jude. This is a big one for Jude. Where it's like, does that actually match? So we'll come back to, well, why Jude and who is Jude in a second. But the point is they were called on the carpet on this idea of orthodoxy. I mean, Jude is the historical viewpoint of Jude is that he's one of Jesus' brothers, that he, along with James, was one of the sons of Mary and Joseph. I know if you're Catholic, that's a problem. Just quit listening maybe for a second. But in general case, Mary and Joseph had a whole bunch of other kids after Jesus. And what we know from the historical record is that none of them believed in Jesus. Then later they do. All right. So then, well, why does Jude get in there? Well, because he was one of Jesus's brothers who Jesus appeared to. And after the resurrection, Jude became a Christian, became a follower of his brother. Same thing for James.
Right.
But then, so people are like, oh, okay, well, first criteria, check. But then second criteria is like, wait a minute. I'll read 3 John. It's like, yeah, John's one of the disciples, but this doesn't seem to line up. Or there's questions of whether it does or doesn't line up. So they are being strict at what they're doing. Yeah. Thirdly, right? Oh, back to orthodoxy for a second. Remember I told you really early on, the 4 Gospels were held up as kind of the cornerstones. And if you add like some of Paul's main letters as being fairly well understood, the earliest writings as we talked about last time, that if people were saying, well, compared like Jude compared to what? Well, compared to what we know from the Gospels and these writings. Okay. They're not just making up an orthodoxy out of thin air and adding it as a layer on top of what's written. They're saying in comparison what we know is written and accepted. All right. Third, usage within the gatherings of Christians worldwide. So again, the idea is what we know of the different churches, did they have was there a 5th gospel that a third of the churches had? Well, that would have been important to know. And we don't have any record or any evidence of some kind of exclusion tactic, some kind of an effort to ban something. So you began to get this idea really early, within 100, 125, 150, that all the churches were using these writings. And it is at this point you start getting extra writings, some of which were written by pastors they knew, that they're like, oh, well, he's a good guy. And it's like, yeah, he's a good guy, but he's not somebody that we think is giving us information that needs to be in the canon. And then thirdly, this is the one that's perhaps most subjective, but that the writing gives evidence of the power and presence of God. So it has a sense that's self-authenticating. I want to read you a quote from a great scholar who I mentioned, I think before, F.F. Bruce, on this point here. He goes, divine authority is by its very nature self-evidencing. And one of the profoundest doctrines recovered by the reformers is the doctrine of the inward witness of the Holy Spirit, by which testimony is borne within the believer's heart to the divine character of Holy Scripture. This witness is not confined to the individual believer, but is also accessible to the believing community. And there is no better example of its operation than in the recognition by the members of the early church of the books which were given by inspiration of God to stand along the books of the Old Covenant, the Bible of Christ and his apostles, and with them to make up the written word of God. Now, there's some Christianese and all that because he's obviously a Christian scholar, but the idea is that as the church leaders are looking at these writings, that they're sensing that this writing has the Holy Spirit or the power of God in it. Again, I realize it's very subjective, so then that leads me to say all four of these would have been used in connection. It wasn't one and then that's the end. Because a lot of people could write something that sounds like it's got divine Holy Spirit, whatever that means, power in it. It sounds all really good, but if it didn't have the other criteria, we're not going to get there.
Yeah.
Because that makes sense as kind of an overview.
No, it does. And I think we're going to get into some of those that did not pass a sniff test. And knowing that these are the criteria, the earmarks of what's real, it becomes easier to understand the backstory on some of these other would be, fake scriptures. And you're like, okay, now I understand.
Yeah.
Why that didn't pass.
And I think it's useful to say also, think about the start of the United States, right? There's an idea. They structure it. They've got a philosophical statement in the Declaration. You've got a bunch of thinkers and leaders and who are doing stuff. And then post-war, right? The dust settles. So like, okay, well, let's get going. And they're doing stuff. And as you go forward, so we're about to celebrate our 250. So at 50, 1826, you've got a whole generation of citizens who were not alive when it all started, right? And as they're thinking, well, what does this all mean? And they're wrestling with it. And if you study American history, they are wrestling with it. They start looking for the early writings of those founders, but then you also start getting people writing at that time trying to give us what we would say one of the first histories of the founding. So they're year 50, year 70. We get the same thing happens when Lincoln, 77 years ago, and then people right after the Civil War, they're trying to reflect back and say, well, what does the country mean? And that's year 80, year 100. They're kind of thinking their way through. And so you have people alive at that moment who start writing about it. So the same thing's happening here. Like I told you, it's the Christian faith was central core around Jesus, but it was loose around the edges, and there was a lot of discussions going on. And so it's not weird, and you weren't saying it's weird, but it's not weird or unusual to think that there were a variety of people who were writing things to try to explain what they thought they knew about this thing called Christianity. And the further you go along, the more those things happen. And I mentioned last episode, we mentioned C.S. Lewis writing in the 1950s. There's people alive today who write books all the time. And your radio shows interviewing people all the time who claim to know Jesus, who claim to be Christians, and who've written stuff. Your radio host has written stuff. Somebody might have known stuff that your radio host, Steve Brown, has written, and they might think it's the most inspired thing that they've ever read, and it's changed their lives in a very positive way. That's 2,000 years after Jesus, and he's saying, here's a way to understand this Jesus thing. So Steve Brown is not doing anything necessarily different that these people doing in 150. I mean, I've written some books like that on the Christian faith and practice. So they're trying to wrestle with it. But then the question becomes, okay, I've got Steve Brown's writing. I've got this book Carl Kreisman wrote. I've got this book C.S. Lewis wrote. How do I understand them in relationship to this thing called the canon or the Bible? And obviously, like I said last time, sort of joking, well, that was 1900 years later, so we're certainly not going to include those. Although there are proponents of people who would say there should be an open canon. So the canon should not be closed. So these same questions, obviously not apostolic association, but these same types of questions could be asked and say, should something from C.S. Lewis be kind of quote unquote in the Bible? Nothing I've written should be, although something I've written is basically just reflecting on Bible verses. In any case, that's kind of the question that's going along here. So those writings are happening at this point. And you've got, again, you don't have TV. You don't have a way to connect. So you're living in Alexandria. You're living in Carthage in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia. You're living in modern-day Istanbul. You're living in Athens. You're living in Milan. You're living in Lyon. You don't know what anybody else is doing, so your understanding of the Christian thing is only what you're taught there. And so that raises all those questions of like, well, how do we get conformity? How do we have a kind of structural artifice to help us? And that is where some of these councils, with the first council, I would tell you, is the one that Dr. Luke describes in Acts in Jerusalem, very early, of saying, hey, let's get our heads together. Let's pray through this. Let's think about, well, what should the answer be? And then they go from there, kind of a thing. So you have two groups of writings, the way I call it. Let's just call them the extra writings. There's some really fancy titles. I don't like to use them that often because I think people get lost and don't really know what you're talking about. But you have these kind of extra writings.
Yeah.
Okay, so group one would be writings of people who were known as, quote unquote, the church fathers. These are the first disciples, and then obviously their disciples, and you keep going to C.S. Lewis and Carl Kreisman and Steve Brown. But, so we have these writings that are happening at the same time, late first, mostly second, third century writings. And, okay, and then you have another group of writings that come out around 150, and they seem to be written with an agenda to either get included or to supplant and to a large degree tell a different story. All right, so let's take these in turn. All right, so anyway, group one, kind of already said it, between the life of Jesus and say that 397 or that 400 Carthage meetings, you've got many other writings. There's a lot of these, like the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, First Clement. You've got a lot of I have these. You can buy a copy of these to read these. There's writings of Polycarp. There's writings of Irenaeus, and so you can read these. And these are like reading C.S. Lewis. They're beneficial. They're in congruence with the orthodoxy. The only thing is that they're not written by an apostle. They weren't used in the first century because they weren't written at that point. So none of the first century church. So on that part, they fail on those criteria, and they never actually claimed themselves. Like I just said, you wouldn't put my book in the canon, right, although I think it stands firm on the orthodoxy of the church. You wouldn't put any of my books there. So they didn't say that either. And some of these, by the way, are quoted. They're quoting the New Testament 27, and they're also quoted by each other as like, this is beneficial, no different than you may quote something from C.S. Lewis, kind of a thing. All right, so then we go to the second group. And the second group is the group that's problematic. It's the group that raises the most questions. So to tie to what I just said, none of these writings were ever included in any of the early lists that I mentioned from any of the other church fathers. They're never mentioned, right? Almost all of them have a false presentation of authorship. So they'll say they're the Gospel of Thomas, meaning the disciple Thomas, quote unquote, doubting Thomas. Not a chance, right? They'll say they're the Gospel of Judas. This is the newest one that came out in the past 15 years. Gospel of Judas. Not a chance. Judas didn't write it. Yeah. The material in these books is so often contradictory to the other 27, so they don't match. Again, like I said, they have aspects of what was a growing heresy away from Christianity, which is a fancy word called Gnosticism, which is a whole sidebar, which we don't really need to get into. Maybe it needs to be another episode at some point as a bonus episode. But basically, Gnosticism believed that there were two gods, and the God that you're told about Jesus is really not a good guy. He's a bad guy because all physical matter is itself evil. And because all physical matter is evil, then that means Jesus, who is the Savior, could not have been human because he wasn't there to represent that God. That's the bad God. And you get down this whole secret, like a bunch of secret knowledge and secret info. And again, there's a whole bunch down that road, but you can get that flavor that several, not all, several of these extra writings in the second group are defending that viewpoint. Then a third kind of marker against them is that the writing is often exaggerated or an embellished. It's almost, it reads like fan fiction.
Yeah.
If you've ever dove into fan fiction, particularly some that kind of really say this character and that character, we're going to build a love relationship between them and tell this story, or there's this other thing they want to go down, which is, okay, do it, that's fine. But it's not in the canon of the writing. It's that kind of idea with these guys.
Mm-hmm.
I love how Eusebius says all of these are to be cast aside because they are absurd and impious. Origen said, the gospel receives only 4 gospels. Heretics have many, such as the gospel of Thomas. These we've read that we may not seem to be ignorant of those who think that they know something extraordinary, so that secret knowledge thing, if they are acquainted with those things that are recorded in the books. Remember we had Dr. Yamauchi earlier in the series, I quoted him. He says, and he's going to use the fancy word, the apocryphal gospel, so the extra writings, even the earliest and soberest among them can hardly compare with the canonical gospels. The former are patently secondary and legendary or obviously slanted. The bulk of it is legendary and bears the clear mark of forgery. So when you read, and you can read these, you can go online and find some of these. You can find books that will print them for you. You can buy these. So let's just take a real quick glance at some of these gospels, kind of work our way through. Probably the most famous is the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
We think it was written around 175 AD based on the manuscript evidence. So remember all the episodes we did about manuscript evidence. Same thing has been done for these. We're looking for evidence. We're looking for a clarity as far as when it was written. Look, if it was written in 75 AD, we'd say that. If it was written in 45 AD and it was the first gospel written, we would say that. That's what we're doing as a historian. You and I in particular are digging into this. Around 175. It's not really a narrative, so it doesn't read at all like the other gospels. It's really like a collection of sayings. There's 114 of them. Some of them do correspond to things that are in the gospels. So you can see a quote, oh, that's just like one of the gospels. That's true. But it also has other statings that contradict the gospels. And then some of them are, well, here's one. Jesus says, see, I shall lead her so that I will make her male. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. So you go, what? So what? You don't like women? And yeah, that's what he's basically saying. If you read the Gospels, you realize that women in Jesus's worldview are one, equal, and in the historical record of support for him, they're actually first in belief and support, particularly post-resurrection. So to have Jesus saying, now you have to become a male, in other words, to get into heaven, well, that's, one of those, they both can't be right. So there's the Gospel of Thomas. The manuscript evidence on this is really poor. A lot of people, I think, like it because it's so poor, because then you kind of can just make some stuff up as you're going on. Gospel of Philip, it was written somewhere around 260 to maybe 290. Also very poor manuscript evidence. We have some fragments. Seems to have come from Egypt. This one's great. Jesus is a shapeshifter. Jesus can just take whatever shape he wants, can appear like lots of other people. I don't know if he ever appeared like some kind of an alien creature, but he could basically do what he wants.
Yeah.
One of the stories in Philip is that he took 72 different colors, which 72 is an important number in Jewish, and he put them all together in like a vat and produced white.
It's the Gospel of Sherwin-Williams.
There it is, exactly. The Gospel of Peter, this one's also sometimes known as the Gospel of the Cross, around 275 to 325. This one's got lots of fantasy elements. My favorite one is when they open the tomb, the cross is in the tomb, and then crawls out of the tomb and starts to speak while it grows gigantic.
Well, if you're gonna do it, I mean,
go all the way.
Lean in.
Jesus is a big monstrous giant whose head reaches the clouds.
Okay.
Gospel of Mary, written 150 to 200. It seems to be a protest writing which is fine for protest writings to exist, against current rules in the church about worship. It's not about women. You might think it's a protest about women. It's got nothing to do with women. It's just it doesn't like some of the rules that are existing at that time about how to do worship. Which, if you've ever been in a worship band, as you and I both have, you know there's a battle that often goes on about worship. Yes. So, the infancy gospel of Thomas, there's actually several infancy gospels.
Okay.
This is probably the best one. It's undated, but most people think it's probably around 180. The earliest manuscripts were like 6th century. So not terrible, but still, it's hard to get a date on this one. But so this one says, we're going to tell you all the stuff about Jesus as a boy that none of the 4 Gospels told you. And while there are some stories that sort of connect to what we think we know, and there's not a lot about Jesus as a child. So this one just makes a whole bunch of stories up. So one of these is, they're making clay mud pies type thing, and he made sparrows and then breathed on them and they came to life and they flew away. But then also Jesus is kind of mean. So at one point, another boy kind of messes up, and so he curses him and he dies. And then there's another story where a teacher comes to try to teach him, and kind of, in some level, this kind of presages how Jesus does interact with teachers, but there's just like this cruelty in the narrative of Jesus being like a jerk.
It doesn't jibe with anything else.
Exactly. Then my favorite one is the most recent one. So years ago, back in, I'm holding here, I wish I could show you on video.
Yeah.
I'm holding a USA Today from April, it was the weekend edition, which they used to do. So it's the weekend of April 7th, 8th, and 9th, 2006.
Wow.
I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, to give a lecture on apologetics to a group of college students. And I came down to the hotel I was in. They had, complimentary copies of this. And right there on it is a drawing that is a 19th century painting about Judas. And the title says of the article, "Long Lost Gospel of Judas Cast the Traitor, quote unquote, in New Light." And it was a whole big exposition that they had just found this new writing somewhere in the early 2000s, and they just released it just now. Incidentally, this is very close in time to when the Da Vinci Code came out. So it kind of made, I loved it. I was so excited. I took it to the college students. I'm like, look at this. This happened just today. And the question is, you know what? If there was a Gospel of Judas in which Judas has been maligned, and we know that the 4 Gospels have conspired against him, hey, let's get that on the record. Let's find that out. Let's dig into it. Let's look for it. Was this written in 30 AD? Was it written 35 AD? Nope, it was written 150 to 180 AD. Again, using all the same historical referencing that we've done for all the things we've talked about, including the non-Christian things we've talked about. Judas in this one is cast as the hero. What's interesting is some scholars see at this time, so around 150 to 180, that there was a group of quote-unquote Christians, so a sect of the faith, that was beginning the process of celebrating the villains of the Bible. Now, if you are around Disney, you're going, that sounds familiar, but that's a different story, I suppose. But this group basically said, so it's in the Gnostic frame of things. So in the Gnostic frame of things, physical matter is evil, and so then the God of this world, they would say, is what's reflected in the Bible. And so if the God of this world hates these guys, they must be the good guys. So Cain, Esau, Judas, Balaam, these are the good guys because the God of this world's evil, because
enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Physical matter is evil. There's a longer list. I've got a book here that's got a list of about 70, 50 writings, and they're just all there. And again, what's the key things? One, the manuscript evidence is poor. The writing of it does not match this historically secure writing that you read in the 27. And ultimately, just so often it's departing. So let's go back and pick on Jude for a second. If the writing of the small little letter of Jude had gone down some road to say, for instance, well, Jesus actually wasn't a human, or to say, actually, Jesus was never resurrected, it's just a good idea we believe in, we would have rejected it. That's the point, is that they were thinking their way through the process and trying to come to a historical, or to use the word I've used before, a historicity that they could sustain about the canon.
Yeah. You used the word earlier, forgery. I think about the stories I've heard about art experts when they are brought in and they encounter a forgery. It's often a very good one. From what I've heard, they kind of sometimes just go, no, they know immediately. They're like, this is not it. And you, in that moment, you could go, why? You're like, I don't know, but I know the real thing. So not to say it's not important to pop the hood and get into the particulars, but kind of one of those criteria is where you're like, I'll find words for it in a second, but this is not it. This is not jiving.
And when you think about how much historical support there is for or about this time period, right? Not even for Christianity, just about this time period. To think that there could be in the dozens and dozens of Christian communities that popped up between 30 and 100, that none of them would have used one of these gospels, that none of them would have been on the record as purposefully and evilly excluding one of these gospels. You'd have had letters or historical evidence about these. We have none of that. These are all 2nd century and later documents that may have merit to read for a variety of reasons, but to say they're at the same level as the 27. In fact, let me close here with talking to you about why the historical canon has such historical strength, right? So this idea of the historicity I've hit on so many times, and it's so important to me. So let me just lay out this series of propositions about why the 27 are so good. Some of these we've already covered, but just to give you a list. First, it's written early within the lifetime of the followers and their opponents. There's room for the opponents to write.
Yeah.
And don't be one of these people who thinks, oh, well, the Christians went around and collected all the writings of all these opponents and burned them. Like, no, they were in such a minority position for 400 or 500 years. Impossible. Second, the writings in the 27 write in a way that invites objection, meaning they name names that somebody could go and find. These people, when they wrote these things, these people are still alive.
Yeah.
So you could find these people out. You could argue against them. You could write something against what they're saying. Third, supported by multiple attestation. The story is supported by multiple attestation, right? The letters and the writings were not written in the same city by the same person at the same time. That's huge. Fourth, particularly with Luke, but others, use of sources and first-person witnesses. Think of the creed that Paul quotes. I think it's 5. I'm gonna get lost in my numbers here. It's supported by archaeology. Again and again and again. We touched on this briefly in one of the earlier episodes. Archaeology, particularly in the latter 20th and now in the 21st century, it's amazing what they're finding. And not like, yay, it supports Jesus. It supports the historicity of these writings. That's the key thing. What you do with Jesus is a whole different question. The writings are not identical in all respects, meaning there's strength through the differences in the story. It'd be weird if they all said identical things all the way through. We're going to come back to that more in our next episode. The next one, Christian communities were fragile at the start, meaning they had to have defensible accuracy. They couldn't just make stuff up out of whole cloth. They'd be too easily exposed. Next, it includes embarrassing information about Jesus, such as there's times when they say he couldn't heal anybody. Now, they explain it, but if you're saying we've got the miracle worker, and then you write in your own biographies or histories about him, yeah, there are these times when he didn't or couldn't heal somebody. That would be embarrassing information if you're trying to talk this guy up 300 years later, if somebody's just making it up. Future church leaders like John and Peter, who are well held up. I mean, Paul's own backstory as Saul, the murderer, and the opponent. Like, you wouldn't write that stuff in if you were making it up. Okay, the next one, 2 more. It includes what at the time would have been considered weak witnesses, meaning, most importantly, we're going to come back to this later when we look at the resurrection. It includes women as a valuable testimony. At that time, and quite honestly, and a lot of times after that, women were not even allowed to testify. They weren't allowed to bear witness. And if you said, hey, I'm going to create a brand new cool thing that people should follow and join in, the last thing you would do would say, and the only person who believes this at the start is this woman who is excluded by society. The fact that it does talk about Paul as an opponent, or it tells that Peter rejected and denied Jesus. Like, you wouldn't tell those things and then later say, but he's the first, leader. It's important, Peter. And then lastly, it's open to the adverse witness and opponents in the capital city, Jerusalem. They aren't doing this in some nether weird little small spot that nobody's ever heard of, like the town I grew up in. This is in the capital city. And so in the capital city, you have the most population. You have tons of people, both Jewish and Roman, who could have written and did write, who could say things, like Josephus. Josephus could have written and said, hey, look, this Jesus guy, not a chance. We know that Josephus has connections in with some of the key Jewish leaders at the time. And so if there had never been a Jesus, or if there had never been a trial, or if he'd just been some crazy flake, Josephus would have said all that stuff. Instead, you get none of that. The Jesus movement was not the majority in Jerusalem, and they could have easily written other accounts pointing out stuff like, he didn't come from the grave, I know where his grave is. It could have been easily done, so that it didn't happen that way. Let me kind of wrap it up. I've tried to say before that the idea of the Bible as authoritative is very important. And it's not authoritative, at least not initially to me, because of what it says, but because of the historical strength behind the composition of it. We've looked at its authoritative nature relative to the manuscript strength. And now as we look and say, well, there's these 27 or 66 writings, and they're all included, and they tell one overarching story. How do we get there? And we realize it comes from this historically sustained journey that is so, so powerful. When you look at these extra writings, yes, they have the value to us as historians. They can give us kind of a look at the diversity of thought that existed, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as well as ideas and philosophies that were emerging. But as you consider their idea of being included in the canon, they both fail historically and theologically. We know that the actual participants of the faith valued what was in the core writings historically, and we know theologically that those writings, that we know from these writings, the core orthodox position. There's no, like, when you read the 27, they're not all over the place. They're not telling varied stories. So when we look at the writings coming from the 150 and beyond, there's a clear difference. The weight of evidence in the New Testament is that the writers, and particularly when you look at the Gospels or the 5 books that tell the history, they've taken great pains to present a measured historical picture of Jesus and his movement, sort of warts and all. Like, we're not hiding anything. We're going to show you all these different parts, including when his followers walk away from him. Go read John 6. He's got a huge, massive following. He's an influencer, to use our cool phrase. And then to some degree, you could say he doesn't turn on them, but he gives them more clarity as what it means to follow him, and they leave him. You wouldn't say, hey, here's the great hero, but all of his followers walked away except for a few little cluster group, right? Even to the extreme, what I'm saying here, of painting somewhat negative or difficult, yet historically accurate portraits of Jesus, of what he taught. I mean, I've said before, there's some parts, we won't have time to get into it, but if you were a Christian leader, like a pastor or a priest, and you said some of the things Jesus said, you'd be fired. And they say those things. They put them in the Bible, which would be weird unless it was historically what happened. That's the part to get to. Look, in my opinion, the entire case of the Bible as its foundation stands on this issue of authority. The collective mind of those who followed Jesus from the earliest moment of their existence as a group, post-resurrection, confirmed these writings as coming from God, seen as equivalent, quote-unquote, holy writings to their own Jewish scriptures. Within the text themselves, the different authors are seen as declaring that they believed other authors are inspired or led or writing for God. This reality is what led to the canonization of Scripture. The canon process, in both the case of the Old Testament and the New Testament, was not a group of men deciding what gets in or out, as a lot of people in the Da Vinci Code movie tries to argue, but rather an admission of what books were already authoritative.
Hmm.
All right, that's our journey there on the Canon. 3 episodes. Think we covered it all?
Definitely nothing more to say about the Canon.
All right, one last thing we're going to do, and not today, is we've got that there's historical evidence, manuscript support, and now we put together this idea that the 66 chosen were right. But when I read the sentences in the Bible, am I really reading what Peter and Mark and Paul wrote? And then sometimes when I read it, it seems like there's parts that just openly contradict themselves. Well, is that, if they can't get their own story straight, why should I follow them? That's what we're going to look at next time.
All right. See you then.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.